Ready for a deep dive into the amazing world of California ants? We've got some fascinating research papers lined up here. You guys sent these in. Should be fun.
I know, right? Ants, they're everywhere, but we hardly ever stop to think about them.
Exactly. And these papers show just how much we're missing. Like, we're not just talking about the usual suspects raiding your kitchen. This research takes us from the Mojave Desert to California's vineyards, all through the lens of ant diversity.
And you wouldn't believe the variety we're talking about. Did you know there are 74 native ant species identified in the Mojave National Preserve alone? 74.
Whoa, 74. Okay, California's officially an ant metropolis. I had no idea. But it's not all about native species, is it? We got those invaders to contend with, too.
True. And some of them have some pretty interesting adaptations, like take the newly discovered Bulbamyrmex pilatus. Not only is it a brand new species, but its diet is fascinating.
Oh, yeah, what do those guys eat? I'm guessing something more exciting than my picnic basket.
Think termite nymphs, and get this, ant brood. They actually raid the nests of other ants for food.
Whoa. Talk about a hostile takeover. That's some next-level ant drama right there. And speaking of drama, we've got to talk about the Argentine ant. Lionopithema humale. Those guys are like the notorious invaders of the ant world, right?
Definitely notorious. They're a prime example of what we call unicoloniality. Basically, they form these massive supercolonies that can stretch across huge areas. We're not just talking about a single nest. We're talking empires.
Okay, massive ant armies. That sounds intense. Do these super colonies ever go to war with each other?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. They've actually found that Argentine ants from different supercolonies can be surprisingly chill with each other. Sometimes they coexist peacefully, while other times they engage in all-out war.
So it's like a constant power struggle, with some ant empires choosing diplomacy and others going for total domination. I'm hooked. What makes the difference? Why are some colonies fighting while others are living in relative harmony?
Researchers initially thought that their diet might be a major factor. Maybe they're fighting over limited food resources or something. But the findings actually suggest that in their native range, at least, what they eat doesn't really affect their aggression levels.
So it's not about who's got the tastiest crumbs. Huh. So what is it about these super colonies that determines whether they're going to play nice or go to war?
They're cuticular hydrocarbons, believe it or not.
Cuticular what now?
It's the waxy coating on their exoskeletons. It's like a chemical signature that helps them recognize each other.
So they're a version of a name tag. And depending on what that name tag says, it's either, hey, friend, or prepare for battle. That is so cool. But let's talk about their impact on the environment. Argentine ants are infamous for disrupting ecosystems, but these papers also looked at them as seed dispersers. What's the deal with that?
Right. So it was thought that Argentine ants might be displacing native ants as the primary seed dispersers for a specific California poppy, Dendromycon rigida. But when they looked closer, they found that while Argentine ants were interested in the seeds, they weren't very good at actually moving them around.
Oh, so they're all talk and no action when it comes to helping those poppies spread their seeds? That's kind of funny.
Yeah. It turns out the real MVP in that scenario was the common harvester ant, Pogonomyrmex somnitidis. They were much more effective at actually dispersing those poppy seeds.
So even in the face of invasion, some native species are holding their ground. That's good to hear. But speaking of those invaders, these papers also highlight just how adaptable Argentine ants can be. I mean, talk about being on the move.
You're talking about their response to humidity, right?
Yeah, they relocate their whole nest based on tiny humidity changes. That's wild.
It is pretty impressive. They're very sensitive to even small shifts in humidity, and they'll literally pack up and move their entire colony to find that perfect spot. It's like they have a built-in hygrometer.
So it's not enough to be a master invader. You also have to be a master of microclimates. These ants are amazing. It makes you wonder what other hidden depths we'd find if we took the time to look closely at their relationships with other species.
Oh, you have no idea. Their interactions with other species, especially things like aphids, are full of surprises.
Ooh, aphids! Those tiny sap-sucking insects that always seem to be causing trouble in my garden. What's the connection there? It's like this whole hidden world of ant cooperation and conflict playing out right under our noses. But it's not just about these big ecological interactions. These papers also zoom in on the individual ant, like how they make decisions. I mean, how does an ant even decide where to look for food?
Well, when it comes to Argentine ants, it seems like their approach changes depending on whether they're flying solo or part of the team.
Okay, so lone wolf versus team player strategies in the ant world. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So, When an Argentine ant is out exploring a new area by itself, it doesn't seem to follow any preset paths or trails. They don't use those scent trails that ants are famous for.
So it's not like they're following an ant GPS or anything,
Nope, it's more like they're just randomly wandering around.
just hoping to get lucky. And here I thought ants were all about efficiency.
Well, in this case, that random approach might actually be the most efficient way to cover more ground when you're on your own. It increases their chances of stumbling upon something tasty.
Makes sense. Maximize those odds when you're on a solo mission. But what happens when they're foraging as a group? Do they stick with that random wandering?
Not at all. When they're part of a team, they totally shift gears. Instead of trying to cover as much ground as possible, they prioritize speed over finding the absolute most food they can.
Interesting. So it's like they're saying, okay, team, let's spread out, move quickly, and the second someone finds something good, we sound the alarm.
Exactly. It's all about efficiency and information sharing. Find food, alert the colony, everyone eats. It highlights just how important communication is for ant colonies and how they can adapt their strategies depending on the situation. But we've been talking a lot about Argentine ants. These research papers didn't just focus on those invaders, they also delve into how other ant species have adapted to the diverse environments found in California.
Oh, right, because California isn't all sunshine and beaches. We've got those chilly winters, too. Did the researchers look into how ants cope with the cold?
They did. One study compared the cold tolerance of, you guessed it, Argentine ants, to a native species called the winter ant, Prinolepis imparis.
Winter ant. That name just screams built for the cold. So who came out on top in this California cold showdown?
Well, it turns out both species has similar upper temperature limits, but those winter ants are much more tolerant to the cold. They can stay active at temperatures much closer to freezing than those Argentine ants can handle.
Wow, so even the mighty Argentine ant has its limits. It seems like those native winter ants are wearing tiny winter coats while the Argentine ants are shivering in their boots. But these papers go beyond just observing ant behavior in the wild, right? They also get down to the nitty-gritty of ant DNA.
You got it. And what they're finding at the genetic level is pretty amazing. Remember how we talked about Argentine ants and their incredible ability to form massive super colonies?
Of course. It's hard to forget those ant empires. You're saying there's something in their genes that can explain this.
It seems so. For a long time, scientists thought those super colonies might be a relatively new development, something that emerged after Argentine ants invaded new territories and the pressure was off, so to speak.
Yeah.
But recent genetic analysis has revealed that even the native Argentine ant populations, the ones back in South America, they form super colonies too.
Wow. So those sprawling, interconnected colonies we see in California aren't a new trick they learned. It's something that's been hardwired into their genetics for a long, long time.
Exactly. It's part of what makes them such successful invaders. They've got this ability built right in.
It's incredible and honestly a little bit intimidating. But this genetic deep dive didn't stop at those super colony building Argentine ants, did it? What about that research on the Temnothorax salviniflade? That seemed like it was getting into some serious ant genealogy.
It was. The Temnothorax salvini clade is actually a whole group of ant species, and there's been a lot of debate about how they're all related. By analyzing their genetic makeup, researchers were able to redefine the salvini clade, recognizing 63 distinct species.
63. Wow. That's like a whole family reunion for these Temnothorax salvini ants. It's amazing how much we still don't know about ant diversity, even within a single group. But these genetic studies weren't just about sorting out who's related to whom. They also took us into the microscopic world of ant-virus interactions.
Oh, yes. That's some of the most fascinating and cutting-edge research happening in the field right now. Using RNA sequencing, which allows them to study the genetic material of viruses, researchers have been able to identify a surprising diversity of viruses that infect Argentine ants.
So it's like each individual ant is its own little ecosystem carrying around this hidden community of viruses.
Exactly. And some of these viruses appear to cause persistent, long-term infections in the ants. They can hang out inside an ant for its entire lifespan, essentially.
Wow. So these ants are coexisting with this whole world of microscopic passengers that we never even knew about. It makes you wonder, are these viruses impacting the ants in any way? Or is it just a case of peaceful coexistence?
That's a huge question that researchers are still trying to answer. It gets even more interesting. They've also been looking at how these different viruses interact with each other inside those ants.
Oh, right. Because where there's more than one virus, there's bound to be some competition, right?
Absolutely. And sure enough, They found that the combination of viruses present in individual ants wasn't random. Some viruses seem to play well together, coexisting without any issues, but others seem to be in direct competition, even interfering with each other's ability to replicate.
It's like a microscopic battle royale happening inside these ants. That's incredible. But it's even weirder, right? Because they also found some of these same viruses in Argentine ant colonies on completely different continents.
You're right. That suggests that at least some of these viruses may have actually hitched a ride with Argentine ants as they spread around the globe. It's like they have their own little entourage of microscopic companions. But, we can't get too lost in the microscopic world. We've got to zoom back out and remember the bigger picture here.
Right, because it's easy to forget that these ants, as small as they are, play a huge role in the ecosystem.
Exactly. They're not just these isolated creatures going about their own business. They're deeply embedded in their environment, and their presence, or lack thereof, can have ripple effects throughout the entire ecosystem.
We tend to think of ants as pests, but these papers really highlight their role as predators.
And their predatory behavior can actually be a good thing, at least from our perspective. For instance, there's research showing that Argentine ants are major predators of olive fruit fly pupa.
Really? So they're going after the pupa of those olive fruit flies. That's amazing considering how much damage those flies can do in olive orchards.
Exactly. They're like tiny guardians of the olive groves.
That's a win for the ants and a win for the olive lovers out there. But their appetite for other insects isn't limited to agricultural pests. I remember reading something about western tussock moths, too.
Oh, yeah. They found that Argentine ants love to munch on western tussock moth larvae and pupa.
It's like they have a taste for the troublemakers. But I imagine their impact on the food web goes way beyond just munching on a few pest species, right?
Oh, absolutely. They play a huge role in seed dispersal, influencing which plants thrive and where. Their presence can cascade through the entire system. And speaking of their environment, we've got to address the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say the concrete jungle in the ant world.
You're talking about the impact of urbanization on ant communities. It's a shame that so much of the natural world is being paved over, but I'm guessing the ants have something to say about that. What did the researchers find?
They studied ant communities along a gradient, from super urban areas to more rural areas in the San Francisco Bay Area, to see if there were any patterns in how ant diversity changed across those landscapes.
I'm on the edge of my seat. What did they discover?
As you might expect, the highest diversity of native ant species was found in those more natural, undisturbed habitats. But when it came to those urban areas, well, those were dominated by invasive species, especially Argentine ants.
So it's almost like those urban areas are acting as incubators for certain types of ants, giving them a competitive edge.
That's one way to think about it. Those urban environments, with their lack of natural predators and often abundant food resources, seem to create the perfect conditions for some of those invasive species to really thrive.
It's a good reminder that we have a big impact, even on these tiny creatures that we don't always think about. And speaking of human impacts, we can't forget about fire.
Right. California is no stranger to wildfires, but these papers focused more on the controlled burns, those prescribed fires that are used as a tool for land management. They were curious about how ants responded to those more intentional fire events.
So not the big, out-of-control wildfires, but those smaller, more controlled burns.
That's right. And what they found is that different ant species have very different reactions to fire. Some thrive in those post-fire landscapes, while others not so much. It's fascinating.
So fire is like a reset button for the ecosystem, creating winners and losers. Tell me more. Which ant species were celebrating and which ones were running for cover?
Well, right after a fire, they saw a big increase in what we call cryptic species. These are ants like Brachymermex depilis that usually like to hang out under rocks or logs, staying hidden.
So for them, the fire is almost like clearing out the clutter, creating more open space.
Exactly. And then about a year after the fire, they saw a surge in the number of seed harvester ants.
Makes sense. A lot of those seed harvester ants rely on the seeds of plants that actually benefit from fire.
You got it. It's a good reminder that even what we might consider to be a destructive event like a fire can actually have positive impacts on certain species.
It's all about perspective, right? One ant's disaster is another ant's opportunity, but fire isn't the only way that we're changing the environment for ants. We're also altering the chemical makeup of their habitats.
That is a huge factor. And one of the biggest changes we're seeing is nitrogen deposition.
Right, nitrogen. It's an essential nutrient, but too much of a good thing can really throw an ecosystem out of whack. What did they find out about how increased nitrogen is impacting ants?
Well, one study looked specifically at how nitrogen deposition was affecting Mesor pergendae harvester ants in California's deserts.
Okay, so we're talking about those desert-dwelling ants and how they're handling this influx of nitrogen, which is often linked to agricultural runoff and industrial activities. What did the researchers discover?
It turns out that those higher levels of nitrogen were actually linked to a greater density of ant nests.
Really? So more ants in areas with higher nitrogen levels? That's counterintuitive. I would have thought it would have a negative impact.
It seems like the extra nitrogen was acting like a fertilizer, boosting plant growth, which in turn provided more food for those ants.
Ah, so more nitrogen, more plants, more food for the ants. That makes sense. But I'm guessing it's not quite that simple, is it?
You're right. It turns out that while the number of nests increased in those high nitrogen areas, the average size of those nests decreased.
Interesting. So it's almost like they're being forced to pack into smaller and smaller spaces, even though there's theoretically more food available?
Exactly. And that suggests that while the extra nitrogen might be increasing the overall abundance of food, it's also leading to greater competition among those ants, who are now having to share those resources with even more neighbors.
It's a classic case of too much of a good thing. But this idea of competition, of species vying for resources and dominance, it really gets to the heart of some of the most fascinating ant behaviors.
You're right. And speaking of fascinating behaviors, we can't forget about those ants who have taken the art of competition to a whole new level.
Wait, are we talking about those ants that have figured out how to outsource all of their work to other ants? The ultimate freeloaders of the ant world.
You got it. We've got to talk about those workerless social parasites.
Workerless social parasites. It's like they've hacked the system. They get all the benefits of living in a colony without having to lift a, well, antenna. How does that even work?
They've evolved this incredible ability to exploit the social structure of other ant species. Basically, these parasitic queens have lost the ability to produce their own worker caste.
So, no workers of their own. How do they survive?
They rely entirely on the workers of another closely related ant species to take care of everything: feeding, cleaning, raising their young, the works.
Wow, talk about outsourcing. But how do they trick another colony into raising their kids? Don't the host ants get suspicious?
That's the amazing part. Over time, these parasitic queens have evolved to mimic the chemical profiles and behaviors of their host species.
So they basically smell like they belong. It's like they're wearing an ant disguise. That's incredible.
They've become masters of deception. And because the host colony is unknowingly raising the parasite's offspring, those parasitic queens can focus all their energy on laying more eggs. It's a pretty effective strategy, if a little ruthless.
Ruthless, but brilliant. But it's got to come at a cost to those host colonies, right? It's like suddenly having a bunch of extra mouths to feed.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Having those parasitic queens and their offspring around puts a huge strain on the host colony's resources. It can lead to reduced worker production, less efficient foraging, and in some cases, even colony collapse.
Wow, so in a way, those parasitic ants are like tiny ecological ninjas, infiltrating and slowly weakening their target from within. It's amazing how these intricate relationships have evolved over time. It makes you wonder, how does an ant species even evolve to become a specialized parasite in the first place?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers are still trying to figure out. But these papers do offer some clues. There's some research on a group of ants called the Pseudomyrmex elongaculus group.
Okay, Pseudomyrmex elongaculus. What's their connection to the parasitic ant story?
Well, this group actually includes some of those workerless social parasites we've been talking about. And when you look at their evolutionary history, it suggests that these parasites may have actually originated within the geographic range of their host species.
So they were living in close proximity, maybe even interacting regularly, and somewhere along the line, a few of them figured out how to game the system.
Exactly. It highlights how evolution doesn't always follow a straight path. Sometimes, close relationships can lead to unexpected outcomes. But that seems to be a recurring theme in the ant world, doesn't it? Unexpected outcomes.
Totally. It's been one aha moment after another with these research papers. Who knew we could learn so much from studying ants?
Right. They're these tiny creatures that we often take for granted, but they have so much to teach us.
We've barely scratched the surface, but even in this short time, we've delved into their complex societies, their adaptations to California's diverse environments, their roles as both partners and parasites, and even their surprising influence on entire ecosystems.
And don't forget those microscopic battles between viruses happening inside each ant.
Oh, right. We can't leave out the viral drama. It just goes to show that there's always more to discover, no matter how small the organism or the virus, for that matter.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, sadly, we've reached the end of our deep dive. But before we go, we want to leave you, our amazing listeners, with a final thought. We've seen how invasive ants, with their remarkable adaptations, can have a huge impact on ecosystems. We often view them as a threat, but what if we could harness their unique skills for good?
It's a fascinating question.
Could we use their behaviors and adaptations to help us manage other invasive species? Turn their strengths into tools to solve ecological problems? It's something to ponder. And on that note, we'll say goodbye for now. Thanks for joining us for this incredible journey into the fascinating world of California ants. Until next time, keep exploring.